He signed the divorce papers with a smirk, thinking he was leaving a broke wife, but he had no idea I had just inherited the $150 billion real estate empire he worked for and was about to become the new boss who would end his career. He signed the papers with a smirk, texting his mistress about Cabo while I sat in silence, clutching a wax-sealed envelope that still smelled of my mother. The judge paused and said, "You should listen closely. Mr. Caldwell." When she read the name of the company he worked for, the room went dead silent. He had just cast aside the one person who could end his career with a single phone call. My name is Violet Moore, and as I sat in the sterile gray-walled mediation room in downtown Chicago, I realized that silence is the loudest sound in the world when you are watching your life fracture into two distinct timelines. There was the timeline Ethan thought we were in, where he was the rising star liberating himself from a dead weight, and then there was the timeline we were actually in. The one contained within the cream-colored envelope resting under my cold hands. I am 34 years old, though in that moment, under the hum of the fluorescent lights and the relentless drumming of the October rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows, I felt ancient. The room smelled of wet wool, photocopier ozone, and coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago. It was a miserable setting for an ending, but perhaps that was appropriate. Across the mahogany table sat my husband, Ethan Caldwell. He looked impeccable, as he always did. At 37, he wore his ambition like a second skin. His navy suit was tailored to within an inch of its life, the cuffs of his shirt crisp and white against his tan skin, a tan he had picked up supposedly at a regional conference in Miami. Though I knew the sun and Cabo San Lucas hit differently this time of year. He was the regional manager for Westbridge Meridian, a mid-level executive role that he treated with the gravity of a head of state. He checked his watch, a heavy chronometer that cost more than my first car, and sighed, a sound designed to let everyone in the room know that his time was money and we were currently over budget. "Let us just get this done," Ethan said, his voice smooth, practiced, the same tone he used to close deals on luxury condos. He picked up the pen the mediator had left on the table. He did not hesitate. He did not look at me. He simply signed his name with a flourish, the nib scratching loudly against the paper. Ethan Caldwell. He pushed the document toward me, the paper hissing as it slid across the polished wood. He said, leaning back in his chair, a smug satisfaction settling into the corners of his mouth. "It is done, finally, Violet. You are going to have to learn to fend for yourself now instead of clinging to me in my career. It is going to be a hard adjustment for you. I know, but sink or swim, right?" I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the man I had spent 7 years with. I saw the contempt he did not even bother to hide anymore. He thought he was cutting loose an anchor. He had no idea he was sawing through the only safety line he had. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply sat there, dressed in the simple black dress I had worn to my mother's funeral only 3 days prior. He had not attended the funeral. He had sent flowers with a generic card signed by his assistant, claiming a crisis at the firm required his undivided attention. The crisis, I knew, was a blonde named Tessa Lane and a reservation at a 5-star resort. My hands rested on the table, covering the envelope. It was thick, sealed with red wax that bore a crest he would not recognize, and it still carried the faint, lingering scent of lavender and old paper. My mother's scent. The return address was embossed in modest black ink, Harrington and Blythe LLP. To Ethan, it was just another piece of legal debris. To anyone who knew the true architecture of power in this city, that name was a gatekeeper to a world Ethan only dreamed of entering. Judge Marlene Keats, a woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too many broken promises to be surprised by anything, adjusted her glasses. She looked tired. She reached for the divorce papers Ethan had just signed, ready to stamp them and send us into our separate futures. "The terms seem standard," Judge Keats said, her voice flat. "Prenuptial agreement enforced, no alimony. Separate property remains separate. If you are ready to sign, Mrs. Caldwell, we can conclude this." I did not pick up the pen. Instead, I slid the envelope forward. "Before I sign," I said, my voice steady, surprising even myself with its calmness, "there is a document that must be entered into the record. It concerns a change in my financial status that occurred 72 hours ago. Under the disclosure laws regarding the division of assets and significant financial shifts pending divorce. This must be reviewed. Ethan let out a sharp, derisive laugh. He picked up his phone, his thumbs flying across the screen. I knew who he was texting. He was likely telling Tessa that I was dragging my feet, trying to squeeze a few last pennies out of him before he jetted off to paradise. "Oh, come on, Violet," Ethan sneered, not looking up from his screen. "What is it? Did your mother leave you her collection of antique thimbles? Or maybe that old sedan? Just keep it. I do not want anything from your side of the family. I just want out." Judge Keats looked annoyed at the delay, but took the envelope. She broke the wax seal with a sharp crack that echoed in the quiet room. She pulled out the document. It was heavy bond paper, the kind used for treaties and deeds of immense consequence. Ethan was still smiling at his phone. The screen reflected in the glass of the table. I could see the bubble of a new message popping up. "Can't wait for the beach. Don't let her ruin the vibe." Judge Keats began to read. At first, her expression was one of routine boredom, the face of a bureaucrat doing paperwork. She scanned the header. Then, her eyes stopped. She blinked as if she could not believe what the text was telling her. She adjusted her glasses again, leaning closer to the page. Her brow furrowed. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, searching my face for something she had missed before. She looked at my simple black dress, my lack of jewelry, my quiet demeanor. Then she looked back at the paper, her hand trembling slightly as she turned to the second page. The silence in the room changed texture. It went from the awkward silence of a failed marriage to the heavy, suffocating silence of a bomb that has been armed but has not yet detonated. Ethan did not notice. He was too busy scrolling, checking flight upgrades. He was already gone, mentally sipping tequila on a balcony overlooking the Pacific. He thought he was the protagonist of this story, the hero who had outgrown his quiet, unambitious wife. Judge Keats cleared her throat. It was a loud, deliberate sound. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said. Ethan waved a hand dismissively, his eyes still glued to his phone. "Just give me the pen when she is done playing games. Your Honor, I have a flight to book." Judge Keats did not hand him the pen. She set the document down on the table with extreme care, as if it were made of glass. When she spoke again, her voice had lost all traces of fatigue. It was sharp, authoritative, and laced with a sudden, terrified respect. "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Keats repeated, and this time, her tone was a command that brooked no argument. "I advise you to look up." The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. But it was nothing compared to the silence I had lived in for 7 years. People assumed that marriages end with a bang, with shattered plates and screaming matches that wake the neighbors. But ours did not die that way. It died by 1,000 tiny cuts, inflicted so slowly and methodically that I barely noticed I was bleeding out until I was already dry. As I watched Ethan tap his foot impatiently against the leg of the table, my mind drifted back to the beginning. We met when he was just a junior associate, hungry and charming, and I was, in his eyes, a blank canvas. Over the last 7 years, as he climbed the ladder at Westbridge Meridian, he became convinced that he was the artist, and I was his creation. He believed he had painted a life for me, one where I was the quiet, supportive accessory to his grand ambition. He hated my job at the Lakeview Civic Studio. To him, working at a community art center was not a career. It was an indulgence. He called it quaint. When we went to dinner parties with his colleagues, he would squeeze my knee under the table. A signal he had conditioned me to recognize. It meant stop talking. It meant that my discussion about funding for inner-city art programs was boring the serious people who moved real estate markets. Later, in the car ride home, the training would begin. "Violet, you have to read the room," he would say, adjusting the rearview mirror to look at himself, never at me. "When talk turns to equity and zoning, you nod. You do not bring up pottery classes for at-risk youth. It makes us look small. It makes me look like I married down." He never said those last words explicitly, but they hung in the air between us like stale smoke. He criticized my clothes, suggesting I dress more like the wives of his superiors. He mocked my friends, calling them average and lacking vision. He carved away pieces of my personality, convinced he was sculpting a better version of his wife, unaware that he was whittling away the only person who actually saw him for who he was. The irony was paralyzing. He mistook my silence for weakness. He mistook my patience for stupidity. Every Tuesday morning for the past 5 years, I would leave the house at 6 in the morning. Ethan always assumed I was going to an early morning book club or a yoga session. He never asked. Not once in 5 years did he ask, "What book are you reading?" Or, "How was the class?" He was too consumed with his own reflection to notice that I was not dressed for yoga. I was not going to a book club. I was going to the very building where he worked, while he was grabbing his morning latte in the lobby and flirting with the receptionists. I was taking a private elevator to the top-floor penthouse boardroom. I sat in the back, observing, taking notes, and occasionally, under the anonymity of a generic initial signature, voting on the strategic direction of the companies that owned his world. I endured his condescension because of a promise I made to my mother, Margot Moore. My mother was a woman who understood the terrible isolation of extreme wealth. She had been burned by men who saw dollar signs where her heart should have been. When I started dating, she made me swear an oath. "Do not let them know who you are, Violet," she had whispered to me, her hands gripping mine with a strength that belied her illness. "Hide the light. Let them think you are ordinary. If a man loves you when he thinks you are nothing, then he deserves you when he finds out you are everything." So, I hid. I became Violet the art teacher, Violet the quiet wife, Violet with the nice but modest family background. Ethan fell for the trap, but he failed the test. I remember the day he met my mother. She was already frail, living in a modest cottage on the edge of the estate, having leased the main mansion out to keep up appearances of dwindling funds. Ethan had looked around the small living room with a polite, pitiful smile. "Your family must have been something once," he had said to me later. "Rich in tradition, I guess, not so rich in the bank." He felt safe with me because he thought I had no leverage. That was why he signed the prenuptial agreement so quickly. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office before the wedding. My lawyer, a family friend who knew the truth, had drafted a document that was ironclad. Ethan had barely read it. He was so concerned with protecting his future commissions and his 401k that he did not realize the document was actually a cage designed to protect my assets from him. "I just want to make sure what his mine stays mine," he had told me, handing the pen back with a wink. "No hard feelings, right, babe? It is just business." "Just business," I had repeated, signing my name next to his. Now, sitting in this cold mediation room, the memory of that signature felt like a prophecy. My mother passed away 3 days ago. The grief was still a raw physical weight in my chest. Ethan had not been there to hold my hand while she took her last breath. He had been at a networking dinner, which I later learned was a private tasting menu with Tessa Lane. When I came home from the hospital, empty and shattered, he had asked me if I was going to be moping around for long because he had a district review coming up and needed the house to be cheerful. That was the moment the promise to my mother was fulfilled. The test was over. He had proven exactly who he was this morning. The courier from Harrington and Blythe arrived with the wax-sealed envelope. It was the trigger mechanism my mother had set in place years ago. Upon her death, the trust dissolved its anonymity protocols. The veil was to be lifted. I looked across the table at Ethan. He was still texting, completely oblivious to the fact that the book club wife he was discarding was the chairwoman of the board for the conglomerate that signed his paychecks. He thought he was free. He thought he had won. He had no idea that today was not just a divorce. It was an audit, and the debt he owed was about to be collected in full. Judge Keats began to read, her voice stripping the room of its oxygen. She did not stumble over the legal terminology. She wielded it like a scalpel, cutting through the thin veneer of Ethan's arrogance with every syllable. Let the record reflect the admission of the testamentary trust and asset confirmation for the estate of the late Margot Moore, the judge stated, her eyes scanning the page with a mixture of disbelief and professional reverence. The deceased was the sole founder and majority shareholder of Moore Sovereign Realty Trust. The name hung in the air for a second before it landed. I watched Ethan. At first, there was no recognition. He was a regional manager, a man focused on quarterly quotas and sales targets. not the opaque, high-level corporate structuring of global finance. To him, Moore Sovereign was just a name he might have seen on a letterhead once or twice. A distant entity far above his pay grade. But the judge was not finished. This trust, she continued, her voice gaining volume, holds controlling interests in a diversified portfolio of 64 subsidiary corporations across North America and Europe. These holdings include, but are not limited to, the Vantage Group, Highland Commercial, Logistics, and… She paused, looking directly at Ethan over the rim of her glasses. Westbridge Meridian. Ethan's thumb froze over his phone screen. The text he was typing to Tessa remained unfinished. His head snapped up, his neck muscles tightening. Westbridge Meridian was not just his employer. It was his religion. It was the altar at which he worshipped. He knew the corporate hierarchy better than he knew his own wife, but he had evidently never climbed high enough to see who sat at the very top of the mountain. "That is a mistake," Ethan blurted out, a nervous chuckle escaping his throat. He looked at the mediator, then at me, searching for a co-conspirator in what he deemed a ridiculous joke. Westbridge is a publicly traded entity under the umbrella of a blind trust. There is no single owner. My wife's mother was a recluse who lived in a cottage. She did not own my company. Judge Keats ignored him. She turned the page, the sound loud in the sudden stillness. According to the valuation audit completed by Deloitte and verified by the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, she read, the total asset valuation of the Moore Sovereign Realty Trust is approximately $150 billion. The number hit the room with the force of a physical blow, $150 billion. It was a number so large it was abstract, a figure that belonged to nations, not individuals. Pursuant to the irrevocable trust agreement triggered by the death of Margot Moore, the judge continued relentless. 100% of these assets, including all voting rights, board seats and executive control, have been transferred automatically to the sole beneficiary and heir, Violet Moore. Ethan's face went slack. The color drained from his tan skin, leaving him a sickly ash-gray shade. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish pulled from the water, gasping for air that was no longer there. "No," he finally managed to whisper. "That is impossible. She is just an art teacher. She drives a Honda." The transfer of assets was effective immediately upon the time of death, Judge Keats said, cutting him off with a sharp glare, which was recorded 72 hours ago. "Mrs. Moore has been the legal owner of your employer for 3 days. Mr. Caldwell?" Ethan looked at me then. The contempt was gone, replaced by a raw, naked terror. He looked at the papers he had just signed, the divorce settlement that gave him his freedom. "Wait," he stammered, his hands scrambling over the polished mahogany table, reaching for the document he had pushed away only minutes earlier. "Wait a minute. If that money is hers, then, as her husband, I am entitled to—" "You are entitled to nothing," Judge Keats interrupted. She picked up the divorce decree he had signed. "I am looking at the pre-nuptial agreement you insisted upon 7 years ago. Mr. Caldwell, it explicitly states that any inheritance received by either party during the marriage remains the sole and separate property of the beneficiary. It waives all rights to future claims on such assets. You were very specific about protecting your retirement account at the time, as I recall from the file." The irony was a tightening noose. He had built his own trap, bar by bar, fueled by his certainty that I was worth nothing. He had signed away a claim to an empire to protect a checking account that held less than what I now made in interest every hour, but the judge had one final piece of information to deliver. The twist of the knife that would turn his professional anxiety into personal devastation. "There is an addendum regarding corporate governance," Judge Keats said, squinting at the fine print on the last page. "The file indicates that for the past 5 years, a proxy has been attending the board meetings of Westbridge Meridian under the initials V. Moore. This proxy has held veto power over executive retention and regional strategy." Ethan stopped breathing. I saw the realization dawn in his eyes, a horrific clarity that made him grip the edge of the table. I knew exactly what he was thinking. I knew because I had read his emails. For years, Ethan had complained to his colleagues about V. Moore, the mysterious, silent board member who constantly blocked his more reckless proposals. He had called V. Moore a dinosaur, a clueless relic, and a bureaucratic nightmare in internal memos. He had mocked V. Moore's refusal to approve high-risk developments, joking that the person probably did not even know how to use a computer. He had spent 5 years insulting his boss to her face, without ever seeing her face. I finally moved. I reached out and placed my hand on the table, palms flat, grounding myself. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the rain against the window seemed to hold its breath. I do not go to a book club on Tuesdays. Ethan? I said. My voice was calm, devoid of the anger he expected. It was the voice of someone who had watched the play from the balcony and was finally stepping onto the stage. He stared at me, his eyes wide, shaking his head slightly as if trying to shake off a nightmare. I go to the 42nd floor, I continued, holding his gaze. I take the private elevator. I sit in the back of the conference room behind the tinted glass partition. I was there when you presented the Lakeshore project. I was there when you tried to cut the budget for safety inspections to boost your quarterly bonus. And I was there when you sent that email calling the board a collection of senile cowards for denying your promotion. Ethan flinched as if I had struck him. You, he rasped, his voice cracking. You were 5 more. I am 5 more, I corrected him. And I suggest you check your phone again, Ethan. But not for a text from Tessa. I believe Human Resources has just sent out a company-wide update regarding the new leadership structure. He did not look at his phone. He could not look away from me. He was looking at a stranger. A woman he had slept beside for 7 years but had never met. He had signed the divorce papers to get rid of a burden. He had no idea he had just handed the executioner her sword. By the time I reached the elevators of the West Bridge Meridian Tower that afternoon, the atmosphere in the building had shifted. It was a subtle change, like the drop in air pressure before a tornado touches down. Phones were lighting up in pockets and on desks across all 42 floors. The notification had gone out at exactly 2 o'clock. Subject, corporate governance update and appointment of chairwoman. I adjusted the cuff of my charcoal blazer. I was no longer wearing the morning dress I had worn to the mediation. I had changed into a suit that was sharp, structured and entirely devoid of softness. I walked through the lobby, the heels of my shoes clicking against the marble with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Ethan was 10 paces behind me. He had followed me from the courthouse, driving recklessly to beat me here. But he had been stopped by security at the turnstiles. Because his badge had been temporarily suspended pending a security review, he had to be manually buzzed in by a confused receptionist who was reading the new company email with wide eyes. "Violet, please," Ethan hissed, catching up to me as the elevator doors opened. He was breathless, his tie slightly askew. The composure he had worn like armor for 7 years was gone, replaced by a frantic sweating desperation. "We can fix this." I did not know. How could I have known? "You have to understand. I was just trying to protect us." He reached for my arm. I did not flinch. But the security guard who had accompanied me stepped forward, blocking him. "Violet," Ethan pleaded, his voice cracking. "Tear up the papers. We have not filed them with the clerk yet. I will withdraw the petition. We can start over. I love you. You know I love you." I turned to look at him. The elevator was waiting. "You signed it, Ethan?" I said. My voice was low, carrying no anger, only a flat finality. "And unlike you, I read what I signed." I stepped into the elevator. The door slid shut, cutting off his image just as he reached out again. When I arrived at the executive floor, the silence was absolute. Usually this hallway was a cacophony of deal-making, phones ringing, and the aggressive banter of sales directors. Today, it was a tomb. The assistants looked up from their desks, their faces pale. They knew. Everyone knew. The book club wife was now the person who signed their paychecks. I walked straight to the main boardroom. The glass walls were clear, exposing everyone inside. The entire senior leadership team was gathered, summoned by an emergency calendar invite I had sent from the car. They stood as I entered. Men and women who had ignored me at holiday parties, who had looked through me as if I were made of glass, now looked at me with a terrifying mixture of respect and fear. Ethan slipped in a moment later, sliding into the chair furthest from the head of the table. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. He expected the blade to drop immediately. He expected a public firing, a scene, a scream. I took my seat at the head of the table. I did not sit in the shadow seat in the back anymore. I placed a single folder on the table. "Please sit," I said. The sound of expensive chairs scraping against the floor was the only noise in the room. "As you have read in the announcement," I began, keeping my hands clasped on the table. "Ownership of Westbridge Meridian has formally transferred to me following the passing of my mother, Margot Moore. For the past 5 years, I have observed the operations of this board as a proxy. I have seen your wins, and I have seen your negligence." I let my eyes sweep the room, resting briefly on Ethan. He flinched. "There will be changes," I continued. "But today is not about termination, it is about transparency." Ethan exhaled. I saw his shoulders drop. He thought he was safe. He thought I was too weak to fire him. Or perhaps too sentimental. He miscalculated. Firing him would be a mercy. I had no intention of being merciful. "Effective immediately," I said. "I have authorized an independent external audit of all personnel files, promotion tracks and bonus structures over the last 7 years. We will be reviewing the merit of every executive advancement to ensure it aligns with the ethical standards of the more sovereign trust." The room went rigid. Ethan's relief evaporated. An audit was worse than a firing. A firing was a clean break. An audit was an autopsy while the patient was still alive. "If your performance is genuine," I said, my eyes locking on Ethan's, "you have nothing to fear. But if your position was built on inflated metrics or stolen intellectual property, we will find out." I dismissed the meeting as the executives filed out, rushing to their offices to scrub their hard drives or call their lawyers. Ethan lingered. He approached me, trying to summon a ghost of his old charm. "That was professional, Violet," he said, testing the waters. "Look, I know things are tense, but I'm glad you are not doing anything rash. My numbers are good. You know I am the top earner in the Midwest region. Once you see the reports, you will see I am an asset." He was already rewriting reality in his head. He truly believed he could charm his way out of this. "Go to your desk, Ethan," I said, not looking up from my folder. He hesitated, then nodded and walked out. He thought he had bought time. He had not. 10 minutes later, as I sat in the CEO's office, a room my mother had never used, my tablet pinged with a notification from the IT department. They were monitoring Ethan's terminal as I had requested. He had just received an email. It was not from me. It was from the newly formed Ethics and Compliance Committee. Subject: Notice of Formal Inquiry. "Mr. Caldwell, you are required to present yourself for a preliminary interview regarding discrepancies in the third quarter fiscal reporting. Please bring all documentation regarding the Riverside Development Project." I watched the security feed on my monitor. Ethan stared at his screen. He slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. The Riverside project was his pride and joy. The deal that had won him his biggest bonus last year. It was also a deal built on a lie about zoning permits that I had flagged as 5 more 2 years ago. A flag that had been mysteriously overridden. My phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. It was a message from an unknown number. But the context made the sender obvious. "Hi, Violet. It is Tessa. I know things are crazy right now, but I feel like there has been a huge misunderstanding. I did not know the full situation with Ethan. I would love to buy you a coffee and explain my side. I think we can help each other. Can I meet Violet?" I stared at the screen. She was not texting to apologize. She was texting to pivot. She had realized Ethan was a sinking ship, and she was trying to secure a lifeboat on the vessel that had just rammed him. She wanted to trade information for immunity. I did not reply. I took a screenshot and forwarded it to the legal team to add to the file. I turned back to the documents, Marissa. My lawyer had prepared. We were looking for the pattern. I knew Ethan was mediocre. I knew he was lazy. Yet, for 7 years, he had failed upward. Every time he missed a target, the target was adjusted retroactively. Every time he insulted a client, the client was transferred to a junior associate to smooth over. I pulled up a personnel file from 3 years ago. It was a disciplinary hearing regarding sexual harassment allegations against Ethan by a former secretary. The complaint had been dismissed due to lack of evidence, and the secretary had been paid a settlement to leave quietly. I looked at the signature on the authorization form that cleared him. It wasn't the HR director. It was a digital approval code from the finance department. I frowned. Why would finance be clearing a harassment claim? I dug deeper, tracing the authorization codes on his bonus checks. They all led back to the same approval node. Someone high up in the financial structure of Westbridge Meridian had been manually overriding the system to protect Ethan. He was not just lucky. I whispered to the empty room. He was a pet project. I highlighted the ID code of the approver. It belonged to the regional CFO's office. Ethan was not just a cheating husband. He was a symptom of a much larger rot within the company. And whoever had been shielding him was about to realize that their human shield had just become a liability. I picked up the phone and dialed the head of the forensic accounting team. Start with the Riverside project, I said, and then find out who authorized the settlement for the secretary in 2022. I want a name by the morning. The forensic audit did not take place in the glass-walled boardroom where power was displayed. It happened in a windowless temperature-controlled server room on the 12th floor. A space that hummed with the sound of cooling fans and the invisible flow of data. I had hired a boutique firm, distinct from the company's usual auditors, to ensure there were no existing loyalties to the management team. I gave them a single instruction: follow the paper trail, no matter where it leads. I sat with the lead investigator, a man named Kieran who spoke in code, and looked at spreadsheets the way a painter looks at a canvas. We were 3 hours into the review of Ethan's digital footprint. We are seeing a pattern in the timestamp of his strategic proposals, Kieran said, pulling up a split screen on the monitor. On the left is his sent folder. On the right, I have correlated the metadata with the login times from your home IP address. I leaned in. The screen displayed a memo Ethan had sent to the vice president of operations 4 years ago. The subject line was the Green Corridor Initiative, a new approach to suburban zoning. I felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I knew that title. I had not just heard it. I had invented it. It was a concept I had developed for a theoretical grant proposal at the Civic Studio. I remembered sketching the diagrams on our kitchen island one rainy Sunday, while Ethan watched football in the next room. I had explained the density bonuses to him over dinner, excited about the potential for mixed-use community spaces. He had nodded, looking bored, and told me it sounded cute but impractical. The timestamp on the email was 8 o'clock the following Monday morning. I read the text. It was my idea. Not just the broad strokes, but the specific phrasing. He had stolen my intellect, stripped it of my name, and sold it to the company as his own genius. He had built his reputation as a visionary on the back of the wife he called simple. Keep digging, I said, my voice tight. Kieran clicked to the next folder. We found this in his deleted items. It was purged from his inbox, but remained on the backup server. It was an email chain from last year, addressed to the chief operating officer. The subject line was streamlining the board. I read Ethan's words. The biggest obstacle to our agility is the legacy voting block. We have dead weight at the top. Specifically, the proxy voting under 5 more consistently blocks high-yield risks. We need to find a way to remove these legacy members who are out of touch with modern reality. I stared at the screen. Ethan had actively campaigned to fire me. He had written a formal proposal to oust the dead weight without ever realizing that the weight he was trying to cut was the woman sleeping next to him. He had called me out of touch. In the same week, he had asked me to proofread his quarterly review because his grammar was atrocious. I stood up, needing to pace. The betrayal was absolute. It was not just the infidelity with Tessa. It was a systematic erasure of my existence. He had used me as a resource while treating me as a liability. Save everything, I ordered. Every draft, every deleted message. I want a timeline of every idea he claimed was his. I left the server room and headed to the legal department. I had brought in my personal counsel, Marissa Vaughn. Marissa was sharp, ruthless, and the only person outside of my mother who knew the full extent of the trust's power. She was set up in a temporary office, surrounded by stacks of files. We have a problem, Marissa said the moment I walked in. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She slid a document across the desk. It was a formal grievance filed with Human Resources. He beat us to the punch, Marissa said. Ethan filed this at 8 in the morning. Right before you walked into the boardroom, he is accusing you of a conflict of interest, creating a hostile work environment and using corporate resources for a personal vendetta against an estranged spouse. I picked up the document. It was well written, using buzzwords that triggered automatic protective clauses. In the company bylaws, retaliation, unethical surveillance, abuse of power. He is trying to freeze you out, Marissa explained. By filing this, he triggers a mandatory freeze on any disciplinary action against him until the grievance is investigated. If you fire him now, he sues for wrongful termination and claims it was retaliation for the divorce. He is building a shield. He did not write this, I said, dropping the paper. Ethan does not know the employee handbook this well. Someone coached him. Exactly, Marissa said. He has an ally. Someone high up who knows how to weaponize the bureaucracy. If we fire him, we look like the villains. We need to dismantle his protection before we can touch him. I walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still the color of a bruise. Ethan thought he had checkmated me. He thought that by crying victim, he could hold on to his job and his salary while he negotiated a settlement. He wants a war of attrition, I said, turning back to Marissa. He thinks I will back down to avoid a scandal. He thinks I am still the woman who stays silent to keep the peace. What do you want to do? Marissa asked. I want to change the rules of engagement, I said. If he wants to talk about ethics, let us talk about ethics, but not just his. I sat down at the computer terminal in Marissa's office. Draft a company-wide memo, I instructed. We are launching a new initiative today, the Transparency First program. We are opening a third-party, fully encrypted anonymous whistleblower channel. It will be managed by an external firm, not internal HR. Any employee can report misconduct, fraud, or coercion without fear of retaliation, and I want you to include a personal guarantee from the chairwoman that no report will be ignored. Marissa smiled. A sharp, dangerous expression. You are going to flood the system. I am going to let the dam break, I corrected her. Ethan relied on a culture of silence. He relied on people being too afraid to speak up because they thought he was protected. I am removing the fear. The email went out at 4 in the afternoon. By 4:30, the system had logged 12 reports. Most were minor complaints about overtime or petty theft. But at 5 o'clock, a notification popped up on my secure dashboard. It was a short message sent from a burner device outside the company network. The timestamp showed it was sent from a coffee shop 2 blocks away. I opened the file. The text was sparse, but it carried the weight of a smoking gun. You are looking at the wrong things. The issue isn't just that Ethan is incompetent. The issue is why he was allowed to be incompetent. If you are investigating Ethan, you need to investigate the person who has been manually fixing his compliance reports for the last 3 years. Check the edit logs for the regional finance director. Ethan is just the puppet. I read the message twice. The protector I had suspected in the boardroom was real, and they were terrified enough to point a finger. Or perhaps, this was an enemy of the protector seizing the chance to strike. I picked up the phone to call Kieran back in the server room. New search parameter, I said. Forget Ethan's outbox. I want you to pull the access logs for the regional finance director. I want to know every single time they accessed Ethan Caldwell's personnel file. The game had just expanded. Ethan was merely the cracked window. I was about to find the rot in the foundation. The walls of Ethan's office were closing in. It was a physical sensation, a tightening of the air that made it difficult for him to breathe. He sat hunched over his laptop. The glow of the screen illuminating the sweat beating on his forehead. The Transparency First memo had terrified him. But the silence from the executive suite was worse. He knew they were watching. He did what desperate men always do. He tried to burn the bridge he was standing on while building a raft to the next one. He had a flash drive plugged into the side of his computer. His fingers moved frantically, dragging and dropping folders, the green corridor, initiative, the riverside zoning maps, the suburban density models. He told himself these were his. He had presented them. He had accepted the applause for them. The fact that the initial concepts had been sketched by Violet on napkins or discussed over dinners where he barely listened was a detail he had conveniently edited out of his memory. To him, they were his intellectual property. And he was not going to leave them behind for his vindictive ex-wife. He held his phone to his ear. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "I can bring the entire Midwest strategy with me," Ethan said, staring at the progress bar on the screen. "I am talking about a book of business worth $40 million a year. But I need a signing bonus that reflects that risk, and I need a start date of Monday." On the other line was a senior partner at Sterling Heights, Westbridge Meridian's direct competitor. The man sounded interested, but cautious. "We heard rumors of a shakeup over there. Ethan, is this related to the ownership change?" "The ownership change is a disaster," Ethan lied smoothly. "The new leadership is incompetent. I'm getting out before the ship sinks, and I'm bringing the lifeboats with me." He hung up. Feeling a surge of adrenaline, he pocketed the flash drive. He felt smart again. He felt like he was back in control. Later that evening, he met Tessa at a dimly lit wine bar in the West Loop. He expected comfort. He expected her to be outraged on his behalf. Instead, she sat across from him with the cool detachment of a chess player surveying a losing board. "They are going to fire you, Ethan," Tessa said, swirling her Pinot Noir. "If they are auditing the files, they will find the overrides. You know that." "I have an exit strategy," Ethan said, tapping his jacket pocket where the flash drive sat. "Sterling Heights is interested." "Sterling Heights won't touch you if you leave in handcuffs," Tessa countered sharply. She leaned in, her eyes hard. "You need leverage. Violet is playing the holier-than-thou card. She is the grieving daughter cleaning up the mess. You need to dirty her up." "How?" "The media," Tessa said. "Go on the offensive. Frame this investigation as a personal vendetta. She is the scorned wife using her mommy's money to destroy the husband who outgrew her. The shareholders hate instability. If the narrative is that the new chairwoman is purging top talent because of a bad divorce, the stock drops. If the stock drops, the board panics. She will have to settle with you just to make the noise stop." Ethan stared at her. It was vicious. It was dirty. And it was perfect. The next morning, the article appeared on the Chicago Market Watch, a popular financial blog known for industry gossip. The headline was "Incendiary, Inheritance, or Inquisition. New Westbridge heiress accused of purging executives in divorce revenge." The article was anonymous, citing insiders concerned for the company's future. It painted a portrait of a chaotic, emotional leadership transition where stable, high-performing managers were being targeted by a vindictive ex-spouse. It did not name Ethan explicitly, but it described his situation perfectly, framing him as a martyr of corporate nepotism. The effect was immediate. When I walked into the lobby that morning, the atmosphere was brittle. Conversations stopped abruptly. Eyes followed me. But they were no longer filled with just fear. They were filled with suspicion. The stock price had opened down 3%. The narrative Tessa had engineered was taking root. People were wondering if I was actually cleaning house, or if I was just a rich girl throwing a tantrum. My phone rang. It was the frantic VP of Public Relations. "Violet, we need to issue a denial. We need to spin this. We can say the audit was planned months ago." "No," I said, walking past the staring receptionist. "No spin." I went straight to my office. My mother's office. I closed the door and sat in her leather chair. The room still felt too big for me. I reached into my bag and pulled out the worn leather journal I had found in her bedside table. I had been reading it in snippets since the funeral. I opened it to a page marked with a blue ribbon. My mother's handwriting was spidery but firm. "Power does not prove you are right, Violet. It only exposes who you are. If you use it to hide, you are a coward. If you use it to hurt, you are a tyrant. The only way to survive the weight of it is to stand in the light, even when the light burns." I read the line 3 times. Power exposes who you are. Ethan and his allies were counting on me playing their game. They wanted a mud fight in the shadows. They wanted leaks, counter leaks, and PR spin. They thought I would be afraid of the public scrutiny. I closed the book. I picked up the phone and dialed Marissa. "Do not sue the blog," I said. "And do not issue a press release. Violet, the board is getting nervous," Marissa warned. "If we do not control the narrative, we are going to control it by telling the truth." I cut in. "Schedule an emergency board meeting for next Tuesday. Open invitation to all department heads. Not just the executive committee. And I want the legal and forensic audit teams ready to present. We are not doing this behind closed doors. We are going to air the laundry. You are going to publicly prosecute your husband, Marissa said slowly. No, I replied. I am going to publicly defend the company. Ethan just happens to be the liability. The invite went out an hour later. It was a bold move. By expanding the meeting to department heads, I ensured that any attempt to sweep the findings under the rug would be impossible. There would be 50 witnesses. Ethan received the notification at his desk. I watched the logs as he opened it. He probably smiled. He probably thought his media stunt had worked, forcing me to call a meeting where he could grandstand about his wrongful persecution. But 10 minutes later, a second email landed in his inbox. This one was personal. Notice of internal disciplinary hearing. Mr. Caldwell, you are hereby summoned to answer regarding evidence of intellectual property theft, falsification of performance metrics, and collusion to defraud the incentive program. He would not be worried yet. He had his protector in finance. He had the green corridor files on his flash drive. He had the public sympathy from the blog post. But then he scrolled down to the bottom of the email, to the section listed as witness list. There were 2 names. The first was Kieran, the forensic auditor. The second name made Ethan freeze. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. Sure, he was misreading it. Witness. Miss Tessa Lane. He stared at the screen, his breath hitching in his throat. Earlier that morning, while Ethan was gloating over the blog post, Tessa had walked into my office. She had not come to apologize. She had come to survive. She had placed her phone on my desk and played a recording of their conversation at the wine bar. The one where Ethan admitted to stealing the files and planning to join a competitor. I am not going down for him, Tessa had said. Her voice shaking, but her eyes dry. I want immunity. I had looked at her. This woman who had helped wreck my marriage and felt nothing but pity. She was just another person Ethan had used. And now she was using him back. You will testify. I had told her. And you will bring the text messages where he told you about the finance director adjusting his numbers. Now Ethan sat in his office. The walls finally closing in for good. The flash drive in his pocket felt heavy as lead. He looked at the phone he used to text her. The woman he thought was his accomplice. She hadn't just left him. She had handed me the ammunition to bury him. The meeting with Tessa Lane did not happen in a dark alley or a noisy cafe. I summoned her to a small glass-walled breakout room on the 25th floor. A neutral ground that felt more like an interrogation cell than a place for conversation. I sat with my back to the window, the gray Chicago sky framing my silhouette. When Tessa entered, she looked diminished without the confidence of secrecy. She was just a young woman in a skirt that was slightly too short for a boardroom. Clutching her purse like a shield. I did not offer her water. I did not ask her to sit. I simply looked at her, studying the person who had been the catalyst for the destruction of my marriage. I need to know one thing, I said. My voice quiet and devoid of the rage she clearly expected. And I need the truth. Tessa, not for my sake, but for the record. She swallowed hard. Her eyes darting to the door. What is it? Did you stay with him because you loved him? I asked, tilting my head slightly. Or did you stay with him because he promised you a life he could not afford? Tessa hesitated. She looked at me. And for a second, the mask slipped. She saw the quality of my suit. The way the staff outside had deferred to me. The sheer weight of the authority I now held. She realized she had bet on the wrong horse. He told me you were dead weight, she whispered. Then, seeing my lack of reaction, she pulled out her phone. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled. He told me that once the divorce was final, you would be left with nothing. He said his lawyers had found a loophole in the pre-nuptial agreement. He said, and I quote, "She will be lucky if she walks away with the used furniture." She turned the screen toward me. There it was. In a blue text bubble, dated 3 weeks ago, "Do not worry about money, babe. Once I sign those papers, she is history. She is going to be penniless, and we are going to be royalty." It was a lie. Of course, Ethan had never found a loophole. He was just posturing, feeding her a fantasy to keep her interested while he used my credit cards to pay for their dinners. But the lie revealed something crucial for my legal team: malicious intent. He wasn't just falling out of love, He was actively plotting my financial ruin while I was nursing my dying mother. Send that to me, I said, extending my hand, and send the rest of the thread. If I give you this, Tessa said, her voice shaking. You promised. I promised that if you cooperated, the company would not pursue you for aiding and corporate espionage regarding the files he stole. I clarified. That offer stands. Send it. She forwarded the messages. I watched the notification appear on my phone. I did not feel triumph. I felt a cold, clinical satisfaction. This was not just evidence of an affair. It was evidence of character. And in the corporate world, character was a metric we could quantify. I walked the evidence down the hall to the legal department. I did not throw the phone. I did not scream. I handed the device to the head of compliance with the same detachment I would use to hand over a quarterly expense report. Log this into the investigation file, I instructed. It establishes a pattern of deceit that extends beyond his professional conduct. It speaks to his credibility. The lawyer nodded, sensing the shift. This was no longer a domestic dispute spilling into the office. This was a systematic dismantling of a liability. While legal processed the texts, the forensic audit team was unearthing the mechanical workings of Ethan's rise. Kieran, the lead auditor, called me into the conference room later that afternoon. He had projected a spreadsheet onto the main screen. It was a grid of numbers, dense and boring to the untrained eye. But to Kieran, it was a crime scene. We found the mechanism, Kieran said, pointing to a column marked occupancy retention rates. Ethan has been hitting his key performance indicators for 12 consecutive quarters. That is statistically improbable for the markets he manages. So we dug into the raw data, he clicked a button, and the numbers shifted. He was moving tenants, Kieran explained. In the system, he would log a lease renewal 2 weeks before the actual contract was signed. He was pulling future revenue into the current quarter to hit his bonus threshold. Then, in the next quarter, he would scramble to fill the hole he created, usually by offering unauthorized discounts to new tenants to sign quickly. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul, and he was taking a commission on both ends. Who approved the discounts? I asked. Knowing the answer, the regional finance director, Kieran, said, The overrides are all there. But here's the kicker. We found a series of emails where Ethan asks for these adjustments explicitly. He calls them creative accounting in one message. It was fraud, plain and simple. It wasn't grand larceny, but it was enough to trigger a clause in his employment contract that voided all severance and stock options. But the numbers were only half the story. The human cost of Ethan's ambition was about to walk through the door. I had authorized a listening session for the department heads. It was a new initiative, a safe space for managers to air grievances without fear of retribution. I sat in the back of the room, silent, holding a notepad. The first person to speak was David, a senior architect who had been with the company for 15 years. He was a quiet man, the kind who did the work and went home to his family. He stood up nervously, adjusting his glasses. I do not know if this matters now, David began, his voice low. But 3 years ago, I led the design team for the Skyline Plaza project. It was my concept. I worked on it for 6 months. He paused, looking at his hands. The night before the final presentation to the board, Ethan asked me for the slide deck. He said he wanted to polish the formatting. When the presentation started the next morning, my name was gone from the title slide. He presented the entire concept as his own. When I tried to speak up afterward, he told me that if I wanted to keep my job, I should learn to be a team player. He got a promotion for that project. I got a performance review stating I lacked leadership initiative. A murmur went through the room. Other heads nodded. It was the dam breaking. One by one, stories poured out. A marketing manager spoke of Ethan taking credit for a viral campaign. A junior analyst spoke of being forced to write reports that Ethan signed. I wrote it all down. Every word was a nail in the coffin. This was not a witch hunt. It was an exorcism. The employees were finally seeing that the system was correcting itself. For the first time in years, they felt that the person at the top was actually listening. By the time the meeting ended, the atmosphere in the building had changed irrevocably. The fear that had paralyzed the staff was replaced by a grim determination. Ethan was still in his office, isolated behind his glass wall. He did not know about the meeting. He did not know about the audit findings. But he could feel the temperature dropping. He walked out into the hallway at 5 o'clock to get coffee. Usually, he would be greeted by a chorus of colleagues hoping to catch his favor. Today, the hallway cleared. 2 junior associates, who used to laugh loudly at his jokes, suddenly found their phones incredibly interesting as he approached. A manager he considered an ally turned abruptly and walked into a stairwell to avoid eye contact. Ethan stopped in the middle of the corridor. He looked around, a confused smile faltering on his lips. He pulled out his phone to text a friend in sales, a guy he went drinking with every Friday. I watched from the other end of the hall as Ethan's thumb hovered over the screen. Then, I saw him frown. He tapped the screen again. The message failed to deliver. He had been blocked. He looked up, and for a fleeting second, our eyes met across the expanse of the office. He looked small. The swagger was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that he was standing alone in a building that he used to think he owned. He was not being fired yet, but he was already erased. The people who had laughed with him were now deleting his messages, scrubbing their association with him as if he were a virus. He retreated into his office and closed the door. It was the only move he had left on the board, and we both knew it was a losing one. It was 2 a.m, and the city of Chicago was a sprawling grid of amber lights beneath me. I sat in the study of my mother's estate, the room heavy with the scent of old leather and the silence of a house that was too big for one person. Spread out on the mahogany desk before me was enough ammunition to not just fire Ethan, but to obliterate him. I had the forensic report proving the manipulation of occupancy rates. I had the witness statements from the architects he had plagiarized. I had the text messages from Tessa Lane detailing his malice and his premeditated plan to leave me destitute. The temptation to use it all was a physical ache in my chest. I wanted to leak the texts to the press. I wanted to plaster his face on the front page of every industry magazine, with the headline "Fraud." I wanted to scream my anger from the rooftops. To let the world see the small, vicious man hiding inside the expensive suit. It would be satisfying. It would be cathartic. It would be exactly what Ethan would have done if our roles were reversed. And that was the problem. I reached for the thick binder containing the trust's spy laws. The specific addendum my mother had written regarding the transition of power. I had skimmed it before, but now, in the quiet of the night, I read the fine print with forensic attention. Article 9, Section 4, the fiduciary lock. My mother's voice seemed to rise from the paper. If the successor trustee is found to be exercising executive power for personal retribution, or if internal investigations are deemed to be driven by non-fiduciary conflicts of interest, the voting rights of the successor shall be automatically suspended for a period of 12 months, and control will revert to the board of directors. I sat back, the breath leaving my lungs. My mother had not just handed me a weapon, she had installed a safety switch. She knew me. She knew that grief and betrayal are a volatile cocktail. She had foreseen that I might want to use the company as a hammer to smash the man who broke my heart. And she had ensured that if I did, I would lose the very thing I was trying to protect. If I fired Ethan because he was a cheating husband, I would lose the company. If I fired Ethan because he was a corporate liability who violated the code of conduct, I would keep it. This was not just a lesson in revenge. It was a masterclass in restraint. She was forcing me to separate the wife from the chairwoman. She was demanding that I be better than him, not morally, but tactically. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was Marissa. She never slept. "Check your email," Marissa said, her voice crisp. He just made a mistake. A big one. I opened my laptop. A notification from the county court system blinked on the screen. Petition for temporary restraining order and emergency injunction. Ethan Caldwell versus Westbridge Meridian. Ethan had filed a motion to stop the internal investigation. In his filing, he claimed that the audit was harassing, biased, and irreparably damaging to his professional reputation due to the pending divorce proceedings. He was asking a judge to seal his personnel files and halt the collection of evidence. "He thinks he is freezing us," I said to Marissa. "He is not thinking," Marissa replied. "By filing this injunction, he just made the investigation a matter of public court record. He has officially argued that the evidence we are collecting is damaging. He is admitting there is something to find." "He panicked," I said. "He is trying to stop the bleeding, but he just cut the artery." The judge set a hearing for 9 in the morning to review the motion, Marisa said. But here is the catch. To defend against the injunction, we have to show the judge why the investigation is necessary. We have to show cause. We have to show the evidence. So he forced my hand, I said, a realization dawning on me. I do not have to leak anything. I just have to file it as evidence in defense of the company's right to audit its own employees. Exactly, Marisa said. But Violet, you have to choose what we submit. If we submit the texts about the affair, the judge might see it as a domestic dispute and grant his injunction. We have to keep it clean. I looked at the stack of papers on my desk. I looked at Tessa's texts, the ones that proved he was sleeping with her. I picked them up. Bury the affair, I said. Violet? Marisa sounded surprised. That is the character evidence. No, I said firmly. The affair is messy. It is emotional. It looks like a scorned wife. We do not use the texts to prove he cheated. We use the timestamps. Compare the times he was texting Tessa to the times he billed the company for client dinners. We do not care who he was sleeping with. We care that he charged the company $400 for a steak dinner with a client who does not exist. There was a pause on the line, followed by the sound of Marisa typing furiously. That is brilliant, she said. It is embezzlement. It is small, but it is theft, and it is objective. We use the plagiarized emails, I continued, my mind sharpening. We use the altered occupancy reports. We use the witness statements from the staff. We strip away every ounce of emotion. We make him a line item that does not balance. I will have the brief ready by 6, Marisa said. Get some sleep, chairwoman. I did not sleep. Instead, I pulled out a fresh notepad. I needed to speak to the board after the court hearing. I needed to address the company. The blog post had done its damage. The staff was rattled. They needed to know that this wasn't a purge. I wrote the first line. We do not punish because we are angry. I crossed it out. Too defensive. I started again. Justice is not about the severity of the consequence. It is about the integrity of the process. We are not here to settle scores. We are here to protect the system that feeds our families. When we allow fraud to exist because it is convenient, we insult every person who plays by the rules. I put the pen down. That was it. It wasn't about Ethan anymore. It was about the architects like David who had their work stolen. It was about the junior analysts who were afraid to speak up. It was about the legacy my mother had built, which Ethan had treated like a personal piggy bank. I walked to the window and looked at the reflection of the room behind me on the side table. The divorce papers still sat, signed by him. The wax seal of my mother's trust resting on top of them. For days I had wanted to crush him. I had wanted to see him beg. I had wanted to win. But as I stood there, watching the first gray light of dawn creep over the lake, I realized that winning was a child's game. Winning implied a contest. Winning implied that he was a worthy opponent. He was not an opponent. He was a glitch. He was an error in the code that needed to be debugged. I touched the cold glass of the window. My anger had cooled into something solid and immovable. I did not want to stand over his broken career and gloat. I simply wanted him gone. I wanted to walk into my building and not feel the air pollution of his presence. I turned back to the desk and closed the folder containing the texts about the affair. I would not use them. I would not let him drag me down into the mud of a domestic drama. I would evict him from my company the same way you evict a tenant who hasn't paid rent, with paperwork, with procedure, and with absolute unyielding silence. I picked up the divorce papers and placed them in my briefcase. I was done reacting. It was time to finish it. The morning sun sliced through the high windows of the Cook County Courthouse, casting long, sharp shadows across the defense table where Ethan sat. He looked composed, but his hands were gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles were white. He had chosen to wear a lighter gray suit today, a subconscious attempt to appear softer, more sympathetic, the victim of a powerful, vindictive machine. Your Honor, Ethan began. Standing up to address the court, his voice was steady, rehearsed. This is not a standard corporate inquiry. This is a weaponized divorce. My wife, Violet Moore, has deceived me for 7 years. She presented herself as a woman of modest means, a simple art teacher, while secretly holding the keys to the very company I dedicated my life to building. Now, she is using that hidden power to destroy my reputation and freeze my assets simply because I asked to leave the marriage. He turned my face impassive. She is not auditing the company. Ethan continued, pointing a finger at me. She is auditing our relationship. This entire investigation is a retaliatory strike disguised as governance. It is a conflict of interest so profound it should be illegal. At that exact moment, 5 miles away in the West Bridge Meridian boardroom, the air in the conference room was cold. The blinds were drawn. The 50 department heads I had summoned sat in silence, their eyes glued to the large screen at the front of the room. I was not there. I was in court, but my presence was felt in every pixel of the presentation. Kieran, the lead forensic auditor, stood before the assembly. He did not use emotional language. He used math. If you look at column C, Kieran said, using a laser pointer to circle a cluster of figures, you will see the reported occupancy rates for the Midwest region over the last 3 fiscal years. Mr. Caldwell reported 98% occupancy consistently. He clicked a button. The screen changed. This is the actual bank deposit record for rental income during the same period. Kieran continued. The revenue matches an occupancy rate of only 82%. The difference, amounting to roughly $4 million in missing revenue, was covered by stripping the maintenance budgets of the older properties. A gasp went through the room. The maintenance budget cuts had been a sore point for years. Buildings had fallen into disrepair. Elevators had broken down and tenants had complained, all while Ethan claimed the region was more profitable than ever. Back in the courtroom, Marissa Vaughn stood up. She did not point fingers. She did not raise her voice. She simply picked up a document. Your Honor, Marissa said, Mr. Caldwell claims this is a personal vendetta. However, the timeline of events contradicts his narrative. The audit was not ordered by Ms. Moore unilaterally. It was triggered automatically by the fiduciary integrity clause of the Moore Sovereign Trust upon the transfer of ownership. Furthermore, the scope of the audit was defined and approved by an independent ethics committee, not by my client. She slid a piece of paper toward the judge. Additionally, Marissa continued, Mr. Caldwell signed a prenuptial agreement 7 years ago acknowledging that he had no claim to Ms. Moore's separate property. He is now attempting to use this court to block a standard internal investigation into financial irregularities that predate the divorce filing. He is using his marriage as a shield to hide professional misconduct in the boardroom. But he could not have done this alone. A voice from the back of the room called out. It was the director of operations. Ethan does not have the clearance to override the maintenance budget. Someone in finance had to approve the transfer of funds. Kieran nodded. Correct. He clicked the remote again. A new email chain appeared on the giant screen. The font was large enough for everyone to read. From Ethan Caldwell to Marcus Thorne, Regional VP of Finance. Subject Q3, numbers, Marcus. We are going to miss the target by 6%. I need you to move the capital improvement funds into the revenue column again. I will make it up next quarter when the Riverside deal closes. If we miss this, we both lose the bonus multiplier. Every head in the room turned toward the end of the table. Marcus Thorne, the Regional Vice President of Finance, sat there. He was a man who had worked at West Bridge for 20 years. He was sweating profusely, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. He looked at the screen, then at his colleagues. He tried to speak but no sound came out. The protector had been exposed, not by a shout but by a time-stamped email. In the courtroom, Ethan was losing the room, and he knew it. The judge was reading Marissa's brief with a furrowed brow. Ethan decided to throw his Hail Mary pass. She entrapped me, Ethan blurted out, interrupting the judge. She admits she sat on the board for 5 years under a pseudonym. She watched me. She listened to private conversations. She acted as a spy in my own workplace. That is fraud, Your Honor. She misrepresented her identity to gain an unfair advantage. Judge Keats lowered the documents. She took off her glasses and looked at Ethan. The silence in the courtroom stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Mr. Caldwell, the judge said, her voice deceptively mild. You have been married to Ms. Moore for 7 years. Is that correct? Yes, Ethan said, breathless. And in those 7 years, the judge asked, Did Miss Moore ever forbid you from asking about her day? Did she ever forbid you from asking about her family history? Did she ever prevent you from taking an interest in her life outside of your home? No, but she was secretive, Ethan stammered. She never told me. Did you ever ask? The judge interrupted, her voice sharpening. Did you ever once ask your wife who she was? Or did you simply assume she was who you wanted her to be? Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at me. For the first time, he really saw me. He realized that his ignorance was not my deception. It was his indifference. Ethan started, but the words died in his throat. The court finds no evidence of entrapment, Judge Keats said, banging her gavel lightly. The motion for a temporary injunction is denied. The internal investigation by Westbridge Meridian may proceed. We will recess for 30 minutes to allow counsel to review the new evidence submitted by the defense regarding the financial discrepancies. The hallway outside the courtroom. Ethan walked out, dazed. He loosened his tie. He felt like the floor was tilting under his feet. He needed a win. He needed someone on his side. He pulled out his phone to call Tessa. She was his witness. She was going to testify that Violet was unstable. She was his backup plan. He saw a new notification on his screen. It was a text from Tessa, received 2 minutes ago. He opened it. I submitted everything to your wife's lawyers, the texts, the recordings, the emails where you talked about hiding assets. I am not going to jail for you. Ethan, do not call me again. Ethan stared at the phone. The screen went dark as the battery saver mode kicked in, leaving him looking at his own reflection in the black glass. He was alone. The audit was happening. The protector was burned. The mistress had flipped. The bailiff opened the door. Mr. Caldwell, they are ready for you. Ethan put the phone in his pocket. It felt like a stone. He turned back toward the courtroom doors, knowing that he wasn't walking back into fight. He was walking into surrender. The gavel hit the woodblock with a sound that felt less like a judgment, and more like the severing of a lifeline. Divorce decree granted, Judge Keats announced, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged chamber. The court denies the plaintiff's request for a permanent injunction against the internal audit. Furthermore, based on the trust documents entered into evidence, this court affirms the sole legal authority of Violet Moore over the assets and governance of the Moore Sovereign Realty Trust, effective immediately. Ethan did not move. He sat frozen at the defense table, the color draining from his face until he looked like a sketch of himself. He had walked into the courthouse hoping to freeze me out, hoping to use the legal system to protect his stolen kingdom. Instead, he had just been handed an eviction notice from his own life. We did not speak as we left the courtroom. There was nothing left to say. The 7 years of our marriage, the lies, the gaslighting, the stolen ideas. It all evaporated in the cold autumn air as we walked to separate cars. He was heading to the office because he had no choice. I was heading there because I had a job to do. When I arrived at the Westbridge Meridian Tower, the atmosphere was electric. The news of the court ruling had traveled faster than my car. As I walked through the lobby, the whispers stopped. People stood straighter, the security guard. A man Ethan had never bothered to learn the name of, nodded to me with genuine respect. I took the elevator to the boardroom. The 50 department heads were still there, waiting. They had been watching the live stream of the court proceedings. They knew the verdict. Ethan walked in 5 minutes later. He looked at me and smoothing his hair. But his hands were shaking. He took his seat at the far end of the table, avoiding the eyes of the people he had bullied for a decade. I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. We have heard the evidence. I began placing my hands on the polished mahogany table. We have seen the altered occupancy reports. We have seen the emails coercing the finance department to falsify records. And we have heard the testimony of the staff regarding the theft of intellectual property. I looked down at the agenda in front of me. Therefore, I continued, I am introducing a formal resolution to the Board of Regents. Motion to terminate the employment of Ethan Caldwell as regional manager, effective immediately for cause, specifically, for gross misconduct, fraud, and violation of the corporate code of ethics. A hand went up. It was the head of HR, seconded. All in favor? I asked. Every hand in the room went up. Even the people who had once laughed at Ethan's jokes, the ones who had sought his favor, raised their hands. They were not just voting him out, they were voting for their own survival. Ethan stood up. He looked furious, his face flushing a deep, ugly red. "Fine," he spat, buttoning his jacket. "You want me out? I am out. But you know the terms of my contract. Violet, I have a platinum severance package. If you terminate me without a notice period, I am owed 2 years of salary, plus the vesting of my stock options. That is a payout of nearly $5 million. Write the check, and I will leave." He looked around the room, a sneer forming on his lips. He thought he had one last victory. He thought he could rob the bank on his way out the door. I looked at Marissa, my lawyer, who was standing by the door. She handed me a thin file. "Actually, Ethan," I said, opening the file, "I am glad you brought up the contract." I pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a memo from 3 years ago. "Do you remember this?" I asked, holding it up. 3 years ago, you led a crusade to fire a sales director named Marcus. You claimed he was padding his expense reports. You were adamant that the company needed a zero-tolerance policy for financial dishonesty. You personally lobbied the board to add a specific clause to all executive contracts. Ethan went still. His eyes locked on the paper. "The Caldwell Amendment," I read aloud. "That is what the legal team calls it. It states that any executive found to have knowingly manipulated financial data to influence their bonus structure forfeits all rights to severance, deferred compensation, and unvested stock options." I placed the paper on the table and slid it toward him. "You signed it, Ethan. You insisted on it because you wanted to make sure Marcus left with nothing. You built the trap that just caught you." The silence in the room was absolute. Ethan stared at his own signature. The $5 million he had been counting on. The money he needed to start over, the money he had promised Tessa was gone. He had legislated himself into bankruptcy. He looked up at me, and for the first time, the arrogance shattered completely. Panic, raw and pathetic, took its place. "Violet," he stammered, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Violet, please, you cannot do this. I have a mortgage. I have debts. Look, I know I made mistakes. I pushed too hard. I got caught up in the game, but I can fix it. I can apologize to the board. I can. Apologies do not fix systems." "Ethan," I cut him off. My voice was calm, not angry. It was the voice of a surgeon closing a wound. "But the truth does," I turned away from him, addressing the room. "As of this moment, Mr. Caldwell is no longer an employee of Westbridge Meridian. Security will escort him to his desk to retrieve personal items, and then from the building." I did not look at him again. "Moving on to new business," I said, my voice projecting strength. "We are commencing a full restructuring of the Midwest region. We are implementing a merit-based promotion system. We are reinstating the original design credits for the Skyline Plaza project to David and his team." I pointed to David, the architect who had spoken up earlier. He looked at me, tears in his eyes, and nodded. "We are building a company where the work you do belongs to you," I announced. "Where transparency is not a slogan but a survival strategy. We are done with shadows." Behind me, I heard the heavy oak doors open. I heard the scuffle of shoes. I heard a security guard say, "This way, sir." Ethan walked out of the room. He did not yell. He did not make a scene. He simply vanished. The aura of power he had worn for 7 years, the charisma, the fear he had instilled. It all dissipated the moment the door clicked shut. He was just a man in a suit who had forgotten that gravity applies to everyone. I did not watch him go. I was too busy looking at the faces of the people who remained. They looked relieved. They looked ready to work. Later that evening, long after the building had emptied, I stood in the glass corridor on the 42nd floor. The city lights of Chicago were beginning to twinkle below me. A vast ocean of electricity. I held the wax-sealed envelope in my hand. It was open now. Its contents read and executed. My mother's final lesson. For days, I had thought this envelope was a weapon. I thought it was a sword she had left me to cut Ethan down. But as I stood there, feeling the quiet hum of the building around me, I realized it was not a weapon at all. It was a mirror. She had given me the power not to destroy him, but to define myself. Revenge is a fire that burns everything it touches, including the person holding the torch. But justice? Justice is a cool, clean rain. It washes away the dirt and leaves the foundation standing. I had not crushed Ethan. I had simply removed him. I had not stooped to his level of pettiness or greed. I had applied the rules he claimed to uphold, and let the weight of his own actions pull him down. I placed the envelope in my bag. The weight was gone. The anger was gone. I looked out at the horizon where the dark water of Lake Michigan met the sky. I was 34 years old. I was the chairwoman of a $150 billion empire. And for the first time in 7 years, I was completely beautifully free. I turned off the lights in the corridor and walked toward the elevator. I had a lot of work to do tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening to the final chapter of Violet's journey. It has been an incredible ride seeing her find her voice and take back her power. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Are you listening from a busy subway in New York, a quiet cafe in London, or maybe somewhere cozy in Sydney?